Today I'm taking a brief look at a film that's become synonymous with the action genre, and unlike many others of the time, has been buoyed up by a longevity that's seen it maintain popularity for over 30 years. Indeed, despite being released in the summer of 1988, Die Hard continues to rank among fans as one of the best action movies ever made, and it has even entered contention for the designation of Christmas movie, owing to its festive setting, narrative set pieces, and seasonal soundtrack. So, that being said, what better time to discuss the movie and everything that made it a game changer for Hollywood action? And having personally watched the film innumerable times, I'm going to cover its key distinctions, which, personally, I think boils down to a unique setting, organic storytelling and escalation, and three-dimensional characters that extends not only to our hero John McClane, but also his love interest Holly, who is very far from the damsel in distress stereotype, and also the antagonist Hans Gruber, who is offered a degree of personality that sets him apart from many of the cardboard cutout villains that we saw in the 1980s and Die Hard's contemporaries. So, to kick off with the setting, I think Die Hard succeeded brilliantly in confining its action to one designated place, which is the Nakatomi building and the surrounding plaza, because by streamlining the setting and the narrative context, it allows the characters to come to life a little bit more, and screen time in the movie was offered to exploring their needs, personalities and intentions. And I'd argue that this brand of siege movie, or lone survivor movie, whatever you want to call it, became a blueprint for later action films such as 2012's Judge Dredd, The Raid, Under Siege and Air Force One, to name but a few examples. And each of these kind of follow in Die Hard's footsteps in concentrating the action on a single inescapable environment, removing any discursive story or potential narrative bloopers that leave fans thinking, why didn't he just go there and do this? It limits the options and the scope for digressive narrative. The secondary set pieces are also great because, to prevent the cat and mouse game between McClane and Hans Gruber getting stale and repetitive, we have the escalating external events unfolding outside too, with Officer Powell and later the FBI appearing, along with Richard Thornburg and the news crew, who throw a spanner in the works for those inside the building. So regarding setting and the characters involved, everything is essential. Nothing feels superfluous or discursive to the central story, and even peripheral characters such as Argyle and Holly's smug co-worker Ellis have a part to play in propelling the story forwards and raising the stakes between the central altercation, which is of course Hans Gruber and John McClane. Now, turning to John McClane himself, who is renowned in pop culture today for the white vest and the wisecracking remarks, it's interesting to consider this very first movie and our initial introduction to him. And digressing slightly, I'm aware that Bruce Willis's McClane has always cut quite a divisive figure among fans, and I know a few people that consider his dialogue and his reactions to things slightly over the top. But personally, I always found him to be, sure, he's a very abrasive personality at times, but also, fundamentally, I think he's very human in his disposition and his approach to things, unlike the muscled, improbable Ubermensch characters of Die Hard's contemporaries, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando, Kurt Russell in Escape from New York, and Sylvester Stallone in Rambo, each of which, unlike Die Hard, is introduced as a competent and grizzled combat veteran, ushered back into service or a mission owing to their experience and unique skill sets. And in these films, events are often set in motion by random acts of violence or combat montages, such as we see in Above the Law and Bloodsport as random examples. But generally speaking, most action films seek to establish that the bad guys are bad and our hero is a maverick badass, in the opening gambit. Turning to Die Hard now, the first 10 to 15 minutes of the film seem uncharacteristically banal by comparison. Indeed, rather than a surly combat veteran being forced from retirement to save the day, we're introduced to John McClane, who, in the opening shot, is gripping his airplane seat in fear and being consoled by the guy sitting next to him, who tells him to get where he's going and walk around on the rug making fists with his toes, in that immortal line. This immediately establishes the humanity and the fallibility of McClane, and we then see him at the airport with a giant teddy bear, bemused by the California natives. And very finally, we have him in the limousine with Argyle, who's his driver, and as a former cab driver, Argyle pushes for conversation with the reluctant McClane, and this is where it's revealed that he's visiting his recently separated wife in California, and as a New York cop, he's flimsily accused his job as a reason for their separation. And I love this introduction because it not only breaks from the mould of the macho action hero stereotype, but returning to the organic storytelling I mentioned, we immediately get McClane. We understand that he's out of his element and far from home. We understand he's separated from his wife and nervous about seeing her again. And we understand that he's a man with irrational fears and flaws, like the rest of us. And we don't need a prologue to tell us this, but everything is delivered through uncontrived actions and dialogue that creates a very organic and natural flow and eases the audience into this character and setting in a really nice, subtle and natural way. However, if I'm going to be really pedantic about it, the only thing that really irks me about this film and the opening scenery is when McClane enters the reception area and the guard tells him to search for his wife in the employee directory. Because this micro-interaction is meant to show the audience, the extent of their separation. Because as McClane searches for Holly on this directory, he finds that she's been using her maiden name rather than her married name of McClane. But when he remarks to the guard that she's on the 30th floor, the guy says, "Oh yeah, that's the party. They're the only people left in this building." And while this comment by the guard is meant to enlighten the audience that the building is empty, besides the people that the terrorists are soon capturing, it's made McClane's directory search seem slightly pointless, and perhaps the story was trying to force a little too much context into this scene, when they could have just had McClane notice Holly's maiden name on her office door or something, 2 minutes later. So, regarding Holly, I'll discuss the characters and their relationships in detail shortly, but in keeping with how the story unfolds, Die Hard maintains pace and, this excellent process of escalation and upping the stakes throughout. And a great example of this is early on when McClane sends Tony's body down in the elevator with the infamous message, "Now I have a machine gun, ho ho ho," which in turn escalates Gruber's hostility, and in particular Tony's brother Carl too, who now makes it a personal mission to hunt McClane down for the rest of the film. But besides this escalation of the action and the shooting and the explosions, which are commonly discussed regarding Die Hard, one of the more understated elements of escalation in the film is the suspense of knowledge and information. And while Die Hard is without a doubt an action movie, it adopts elements of classical thriller to maintain tension, such as whether Hans will discover Holly, or whether McClane will successfully alert the police, or whether the FBI will successfully blow everyone up. And the fact that both the good guys and the bad guys are sharing the same radio frequencies, when they're communicating one another, it completely levels the playing field and makes this an interesting dynamic to develop and accent the otherwise perhaps formulaic action plot points. And just to summarise the extent of the escalation in the film, it's just amusing to look at the beginning and the ending, and it's amusing to see that McClane starts off as this down-and-out cop with a giant teddy bear and a fear of flying, and then 2 hours later he's this guy who's jumping off a building with an industrial fire hose at the end. So taking this macro view of Die Hard, we can see how the excitement and the anticipation just exponentially builds over the duration of the movie. So, moving on to the characters, each of them, from the primary characters to the peripheral, are offered moments of screen time that give glimmers of personality, and unlike other action films of the time, where enemies and civilians outside of the central cast are merely collateral damage for the most part, Die Hard offers empathy and a degree of three-dimensionality, I suppose, to each of its characters. For example, relating back to the German brothers, Tony and Carl, we see a short scene at the beginning of the film where, having just breached the building, Tony is trying to reroute the phone lines to avoid contact to and from the outside world. And while he's doing this, Carl shows up with a chainsaw and roughly just cuts through all of the circuitry, angering his brother and rendering his delicate work redundant. And this is about 10 seconds of screen time, but it immediately establishes the idea of Carl as this volatile individual who enjoys this brotherly antagonism that's very common among siblings, and I can personally attest to. But also in retrospect, we can appreciate that this scene, is the last time that these brothers see one another alive. So it's this small act of aggravation, that's a little bit more significant than it might first seem. And while Carl is this violent bruiser stereotype, who, to use video game vernacular, is something of a sub-boss, this little addition and interaction with his brother just gives him that much more personality and motive compared to similar characters in other movies, such as, again, a random example is, for example, Bolo in Enter the Dragon, the Bruce Lee film. And O'Hara as well, actually. There's 2 sub-bosses in that film. But, looking at Bolo Young and O'Hara in Enter the Dragon, they're these guys that exist just to fight Bruce Lee and his supporting cast. And they have no real meaning, motive, or purpose. They're just bad guys for the sake of being bad guys, at least as far as the audience is concerned. But looking at Carl by comparison, we just have this little glimmer of who he is and where he's from and the things he holds dear, perhaps you could say. So, again, a little bit of personality that Die Hard offers to these characters that others don't. Moving on, Ellis is another great character who is immediately established as the office douchebag, and his opportunism with Holly not only foreshadows his actions later in trying to barter with Hans, but his covetous demeanour also emphasises McClane's aptitudes and his vigilance as a cop. For example, when first meeting Ellis, who is hastily wiping down a table, grinning blinklessly like only a cokehead can, McClane whispers to him, "You've missed some," when he's introduced to Ellis, indicating that he's immediately clocked what he's up to. He also tells Holly that Ellis is into her, which proves true, as the audience has just witnessed Ellis trying to coax Holly out to dinner with him. So, with all his egotism and douchey name-dropping of the Rolex and saying he does million-dollar deals for breakfast, Ellis is a classic dislikable office guy, and I think the American term for him would be a yuppie. Now, despite all of this, I think at least some of us feel a degree of sympathy for Ellis once he's run out of options with Hans, because his inflated sense of self and cocaine-driven Dutch courage leads him to believe that he can talk his way out of trouble with what turns out to be some very ruthless antagonists. And we find that he's smug enough to have requested a Coca-Cola from one of the captors, which I think is a brilliant subtlety, because we don't see him asking for it. We just see it kind of brought over to his table and him give a thumbs up to Hans, which is kind of hilarious, this kind of inflated sense of self and ego that he has. And the whole reason he's there is because he's trying to spin his knowledge of John McClane to his advantage and to save his own skin, which quickly unravels when we see him executed. So for my part, I always felt a bit bad for Ellis because he's not exactly a nice person, but it's prudent to note that he never threw Holly under the bus when he could have used that information to save himself. And a subtle piece of mise-en-scene earlier in the film shows that when he's doing cocaine in Holly's office, he's actually had the decency to turn the pictures of her children away from himself so that they don't see his shame, which is really subtle, but I think it's a very interesting, fleeting, glimpse at this character. And again, it just goes back to this personality that even the secondary and tertiary characters are sort of imbued with. And Ellis, for his part, has this sort of weirdly principled but very unlikable characteristic, at the same time. Moving on to Al Powell, he's another great catalyst to the action in the film, because he acts as McClane's, and the audience's, I suppose, insight to the outside world. And despite being an on-duty officer who calls in the incident once McClane drops a German on his car, Powell's main purpose is to humanise McClane and develop character through sentimental reprieves and encouragement throughout the film. Powell himself is also the humanising aspect of the authorities in the film, because we see the SWAT team commander and the FBI as almost cartoonishly obnoxious and incompetent individuals regarding this escalating situation. And they have a notable lack of empathy for both McClane and the hostages, so it's almost like Powell is the one guy that's on side. He also has a moment of, not Deus Ex Machina per se, but it's that convenient ending where he's mentioned earlier in the film that he can never bring himself to draw his weapon because he's accidentally shot a kid in the past. But then he saves the day by finally shooting the seemingly invincible Carl at the end of the movie. Now, there's a few tertiary characters I'm going to skirt over. Mr. Takagi and Argyle are all great additions to the story in their own small ways, whether they are simply reacting to something to emphasise the personality of a central character, such as Mr. Takagi calling Gruber's bluff by saying you'll just have to kill me, and then he does, to Argyle's role as a rookie limo driver, which prompts his uncharacteristic conversation with McClane at the beginning of the film, which allows the character development to take place. And then, of course, later doing him the favour of waiting downstairs, which results in him being trapped in the building all night for short, comical cutaways. Finally, with the secondary cast, Holly is worth a mention because looking at Die Hard in terms of historical context, particularly within the action movie genre, we are knee-deep in damsel in distress territory where female roles are concerned. And they either appear as pretty faces that need to be saved, or They are otherwise completely divorced from the action. That being said, at 1988, at the time Die Hard was released, the first two Alien films had come out, featuring Sigourney Weaver as the excellent Ripley, and this was a massive watershed moment for female roles in film, but it's prudent to mention that Alien was the exception rather than the rule. So, regarding Holly, she's great because she's not sexualised or romantically inclined at all, and she's hardly this damsel in distress stereotype. And even though the hero is her husband, she's actually kind of a hard ass to him, and she stands up to John, Ellis, and most importantly, Hans Gruber over the course of the film. And indeed, Hans even seems to be somewhat impressed by her pragmatic demands for the hostages, and her notable lack of fear in his presence. And all of this contributes to Holly Gennaro being a three-dimensional and somewhat standout character. So, let's move on and discuss John McClane and Hans Gruber now, because where the 80s were characterised by a lot of formulaic explosion-driven action movies, Die Hard is buoyed up as much by this relationship between hero and antagonist, if not more so than it is by the shooting and the combat and the explosions. And the dynamic and the dichotomy between John and Hans, the chemistry and the tension between them, is essential to this film becoming the milestone it did in movie history, I think. So, in previous videos I've mentioned the odd couple dynamic when discussing certain characters that operate in close proximity, and although McClane and Gruber don't quite fit this mould, there are characteristic binaries between them that run along lines such as American foreigner, self and other, good and bad, which fits the stereotype of many action films such as Air Force One, where, for example, we saw the wholesome US President Harrison Ford contending with Gary Oldman's Russian villain, and so on. But regarding Die Hard, it's also notable that John and Hans are also separated along economic and social class lines, which sounds like a really douchey, pretentious observation to make, but I think it really plays into their respective characters quite heavily, and it's what brought them to life a little bit more, and the banter and the altercations between them. Regarding Hans, he states outright to Mr. Takagi his admiration of suits, architecture and aesthetics, and to quote him directly, he states that he had the benefits of a classical education. So this lends him a certain privileged, almost patronising slant, and an intelligence that in many ways directly contrasts with the picture that's painted of John McClane early on. Turning to McClane, it's a little more subtle, but we can often notice a resistance and a distaste for middle-class luxuries and material gain, which shows this sort of working-class, everyman roots in him. And indeed, rather than sitting in the back of the limousine at the beginning of the film, he sits up front beside Argyle, because he clearly doesn't like the privileged connotations of being chauffeured around everywhere. Equally, when Ellis is bragging about Holly being given a Rolex, McClane has a somewhat bemused expression about the weight that Ellis is putting on this brand name. And this scene also shows McClane, Holly, Ellis and Takagi stood together in a single room, and the contrast in their respective wardrobes is very apparent too, with McClane wearing plaid, checks and corduroy, and Takagi, for example, wearing a John Phillips London suit, which is what Hans immediately notices and remarks upon in the elevator. And just for the record, I think John Phillips is almost certainly a fictional brand, because I have never seen nor heard of it on Savile Row or anywhere in London. Now, moving on, this dynamic between the characters of John and Hans is excellent, because what we find during the film is it's very much a case of book smarts versus street smarts, with Hans being this clearly very gifted individual who's put together a flawless heist plan, and John, who's a very much procedural, rough-around-the-edges cop, whose resourcefulness sees him do things like hide above the elevator to gain information about the bad guys and use his wits to give Hans an unloaded gun later in the film, for example, which prove excellent set pieces that counter the often mindless, guns-blazing ass-kicking of other 80s action movies. It also crafts an amusing dynamic between the two, because when Hans and John begin interacting over the radio, the former goes off on some verbose monologue accusing McClane of being, to quote him, another orphan of a bankrupt culture who thinks he's John Wayne. And when he's saying this, McClane's got this priceless expression on his face, as if to say, what the fuck are you on about? And it's this core difference in their respective characters that makes them so great, and adds much more weight to their De Niro-Pacino heat moment when they finally come face to face. Although, of course, it's not as remotely momentous as the De Niro-Pacino moment, so I retract that slightly. So, Alan Rickman coming to the role as a classically trained British thespian, offering Gruber a shrewd intelligence and merciless ruthlessness, contrasts brilliantly with Willis as the impromptu Hollywood hero. And as Hans escalates in ruthlessness and desperation during the film, such as bombing the police RV, so too does McClane, responding kind, with bombing the elevator with C4, for example. And it's this escalation driven by these excellently realised characters that makes Die Hard what it is. And I think kudos to Willis in particular, as he spends most of the film acting by himself and responding to things without a character to bounce off, which must have been a unique and very interesting challenge as an actor. And I also like how his attire and his stamina clearly drains and fatigues over the course of the film. And unlike other action movies I've seen, from the time, where the hero can often seem strangely invincible, McClane's white vest degrades to a muddied black and his feet get filled with glass, and the environment profoundly impacts McClane, both mentally and physically, over the course of the movie, adds to this idea of his fallibility, which, I think was also quite unique for the time. So this has been quite short and sweet, I know, but I just felt like this was the best time of year to talk about Die Hard, if you're going to talk about it. And it sounds like a cliche, but the format of the movie, the brilliant soundtrack by the late Michael Kamen, and the brilliant acting by the whole cast, with particular regard to Rickman and Willis, I just feel like Die Hard is one of those watershed Hollywood moments that's worth discussion. And although it wasn't particularly appreciated, in its own time and at the time it was released, it's developed this certain irreverence and immortality as time's worn on. And, again, I think it's just worthy of a short discussion. So if you got this far, kudos to you, and thank you very much for listening. And feel free to drop a comment below and start a discussion with your own thoughts on the film.